Hey everyone, my name is Austin, and today I'm going to talk to you about Canada's promotion of genocide against Indigenous women through coerced sterilization. Now, that's a lot of big words that can essentially sound like a very complex thing. However, I'm here to simplify and inform you, regardless of any prior knowledge on the issue at hand. Now, it's become apparent that within the fields of universal healthcare and overall contribution to medicine, Canada is without a doubt one of the most recognized countries in the world. A combination of healthy living standards, consistent with top-class doctors and facilities, Canada simply takes a lot of pride in its healthcare sector. With such dedication, one would assume that medical practices across Canada would be conducting themselves as per professional and ethical standards. But as Vice News reporter Ankita Rao reports, that seems to be quite the opposite. It's bizarre to find out that the healthcare standards that Canadians pride themselves on is the same healthcare that is being manipulated to sterilize Aboriginal women by coercion or force. Before getting in depth of understanding the Vice article itself and the issues associated with sterilization, it's important to understand what sterilization is and what the medical practice actually consists of. Now, as described by the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, sterilization is described as a permanent method of birth control. Now, you can see this diagram here, a diagram of the fallopian tubes and showing the incisions of where a cut or a block site would be, allowing the egg and the sperm to not interact, forming this kind of permanent method of birth control. And this is just one of the forms of sterilization. The medical procedure includes the tying of fallopian tubes and removal of ovaries, but there are other ways of sterilization. So this concept of sterilizing Aboriginal women has been taking place in Canada since the 1970s. As a result of colonialism and systemic racism, Aboriginal women being sterilized in the 1970s was largely due in part of the eugenics movement. Now, the eugenics movement was aimed at improving the genetic composition of the human race, and this included discriminating against people that, or races, or genders, or sexes that certain people seem to view as less or as a minority, and Aboriginal women were no exception to this, being placed in the minority. In summation, the eugenics movement was a way for justifying acts of genocide, which we'll see in comparison to Nazi Germany under the rule of Adolf Hitler. Now, drawing a close comparison to the eugenics movement with the Sexual Sterilization Act, which was implemented in the 1920s in Canada, specifically in British Columbia and Alberta, which, in a form of systemic racism, wanted to protect a quote-unquote gene pool, and by means of protecting this gene pool, one of the ways or procedures that was found to be most effective was through the act of sterilization. Connections can be easily drawn to Adolf Hitler and the Nazi reign, as he used a similar procedure of sterilization to forcibly remove people. But unlike Germany and their attempts to move on and improve from a violent history, Canada has yet to implement a law that bans forced sterilization. This act of colonialism was also motivated by the eugenic movement, in the sense that they were trying to attempt to take people away from their original land in an attempt to make way for their best respective interests. For Nazi Germany, it was their military. And for Canada, it's the lack of urgency to attempt to enter reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. One of the victims that was reported in the Vice News article was McCurdy, which is pictured here in this slide. She was a victim of forced sterilization at the age of 13 years old, and the procedure was done without consent and by force. So not only an act of coerced sterilization, but one of the acts of forced sterilization. The Vice News article reports that she had been asleep when the procedure was conducted and didn't know that she actually had been sterilized until she tried to have a baby later on. And the medical imaging showed that some form of forced sterilization had been conducted, and the doctor who was seeing McCurdy at the time was distraught with what he had seen and questioning the sanity of the doctors who had committed such a crime. Here's a graph with the quote that says, in Canada, the Aboriginal birth rate was 47 per 1,000 people in the 1960s and fell to 28 per 1,000 people by 1980s. And the graph kind of helps illustrate that. This was reported in the Vice article, but is a statistic by Government Canada. You can see the dramatic drop-off between 1968 and 1980, almost cutting it in half, which is just a mind-boggling statistic to try to wrap your head around. Constitutional and human rights violations. In Canada, human rights are protected by federal, provincial, and territorial or municipal laws. Canada's human rights laws stem from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and sterilization violates all of the following. From the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, under the Fundamental Freedoms section, Article 2, the violation of everyone has the following fundamental freedoms of conscience, religion, freedom, belief. For legal rights under Article 7, it's a violation of everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and the right not to be deprived thereof except in accordance with the principle of fundamental justice. For human rights, one of the core principles that it's in violation with is the violation of the right to access of healthcare services free from discrimination based on race and gender. And in this situation, Aboriginal women are being discriminated against, them being Aboriginal as well as them being women. And as well, under treatment and punishment of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Article 12, the right not to be subject to cruel and unusual treatment or punishment. And from understanding the medical perspective and hearing stories from women such as McCurdy, where professional doctors are seeing images and reacting in such a grotesque way, it's clear that this is a clear violation and unusual treatment or punishment. In reference to some of the information in the previous slides, this is the class action lawsuit that's led by Indigenous rights attorney Elisa Lombard. She's advocating for over 100 women, and this class action lawsuit's been in progress since early 2018, late 2017. And her goal is to basically aim women that were affected by sterilization during that big drop-off period between the 1960s and the 1980s. And essentially, these women are seeking justice and a sweeping reform to the health system in Canada and how Aboriginals and Aboriginal women are dealt with within the health sector, as well as seeking $7 million Canadian in damages. Coming to the end of the presentation, it's important to note on DRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And UNDRIP is the acronym, of course. And now this was adopted by the United Nations in around 2007, where everyone had to vote. Canada was one of the four countries, I believe, who voted against the declaration due to conflicts with such things as the Canadian Charter and the Indian Act, as well as just different points of views on how effective it actually is. Now, the act of coerced and or forced sterilization is a violation of Article 43, which states the rights recognized herein constitute the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of the Indigenous peoples of the world, and as well as Article 24, which states Indigenous individuals also have the right to access without any discrimination to all social and health services. Now, moving on to the future and trying to take proactive steps in terms of from the perspective of people within the government, people involved in the class action lawsuit, it's just important to raise awareness and make sure that people are starting to become more cognizant of the issues that are still present between Indigenous peoples and Canada as a whole. And this is important for us to take progressive steps into reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and Canadians within society.